He read the words slowly, almost gently, as if afraid they might bruise me more than they already had. Mrs. Hale, your son signed these papers on your behalf. I remember sitting very still, my hands folded in my lap, like a schoolgirl caught cheating on an exam. At 72, I thought I'd learned all the ways life could surprise me. But apparently, I had missed a lesson. I heard the clock on the wall tick twice before I found my voice, though the voice that finally came out didn't sound like mine. Repeat that, I said, out loud, for him to hear. My son, my only son, shifted in his chair next to me. He didn't look at me. He looked at his watch. Strange how that small gesture hurt more than the words themselves. A lifetime of raising him, feeding him, caring for him through illnesses and heartbreaks. And now he couldn't even meet my eyes while a lawyer read aloud the documents he'd signed behind my back. The room felt too white, too clean, too cold. The smell of paper and ink mixed with a faint lemon polish. I used to love the scent of order. Today, it felt like the smell of a place where truths came to die. My lawyer, Harold Finch, had known me since my husband died 12 years ago. He'd seen me weep, seen me solve problems I had no strength for, seen me age gently but steadily. I saw pity in his eyes now, and something else I couldn't name. A quiet indignation, maybe. A man's discomfort in the presence of something shameful, even if he wasn't the one who caused it. He set the papers on the desk, right between me and my son. Mrs. Hale, he said softly, I need to confirm whether you intended for these authorizations to be executed. I felt a hollow open under my ribs. Authorizations for what exactly? And Harold, being an honest man, didn't soften the blow. He read it as it was written. A transfer of ownership of my home. A permission to initiate a credit line against the property. A clause granting my son financial control over decisions for my convenience. Convenience. Such an innocent word, twisted into a blade. My son, Oliver, exhaled sharply, as though bored. Mom, it's not a big deal. Harold's being dramatic. It's standard paperwork. I told you about it. Remember? You said yes. I looked at him then. Really looked. At the silvering hair at his temples, he pretended not to be proud of. At the expensive coat he insisted on wearing indoors. At the restless tapping of his foot, a habit from childhood when he used to tap before lying. No, I said quietly. You never told me. Yes, I did, he insisted, more loudly now. You just forgot. It happens. You get things mixed up sometimes. That stung. Not because of the words, but because of how easily they came to him. How naturally he used my age as a shield for himself. If you enjoy the stories here, dear, you're welcome to join our Patreon. There you'll find exclusive tales that never appear on YouTube, and new stories come out earlier than anywhere else. The link is just below. We're waiting for you. Harold cleared his throat. For legal purposes, I must confirm whether Mrs. Hale understood these documents when signing. Of course she understood, Oliver snapped. But Harold didn't look at him. He looked at me. And suddenly, the pity in his eyes felt like a mirror reflecting all the years I'd spent convincing myself everything was fine. Did I know what I had signed? Had I even signed anything? I searched my memory, wading through days that looked so alike in their quiet routines. And yes, there it was. A winter morning. Oliver dropping by, just to help with the bills. A stack of envelopes. A few papers slipped in with the electricity statement. His hurried tone. My tired trust. I had signed, but I had not known. Something inside me, Something small and old and long ignored, clenched its fist. I straightened my back. My voice returned, steady this time, not strong yet, but sharper than he expected. "Harold," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on my son, "read every line aloud. Slowly." Oliver groaned. "Mom, for God's sake." "No," I said, and my tone stopped him. It stopped Harold. It even stopped the clock, or so it felt. I didn't raise my voice. Women like me rarely do. But there's a certain quiet that carries farther than shouting ever could. The quiet of a woman who has finally, after decades of swallowing her words, decided to speak. "Read," I repeated. Harold began again, deliberate and careful, each sentence dropping between us like a stone in still water. And as he read, I felt something warm spread through my chest. Not anger, not yet, but the early trembling shape of it. By the time he finished, Oliver was glaring at the carpet. By the time he finished, I knew exactly what had happened. And by the time he finished, I lifted my chin and said, softly, but unmistakably, "Oliver, sit down. We're not done." That was the moment, right there, when I realized this story wasn't going to be about my weakness. It was going to be about my awakening. When you raise a child alone, you learn to live with a certain softness inside your chest. A softness that forgives too quickly, bends too easily, and excuses things no one else would excuse. I suppose that softness kept me from seeing the truth long before Harold laid those papers on his desk. Oliver wasn't always this way. He was once a boy who clung to my skirt when thunder cracked, who brought me dandelions in chubby fists, who cried when I worked late at the hospital because he didn't want the house to feel empty without me. Even after his father died, suddenly, brutally, Oliver had been the one bright thread keeping me steady. I held on to it for years, but life changes people. Or maybe it simply reveals them. He left home at 23, hungry for a life with marble countertops and leather seats. He started working in real estate, wearing suits 2 sizes too big for him until he could afford the ones that fit. I was proud. Of course I was. But even then he began to speak of me differently, as if I were a relic, a reminder of a past he didn't want to display. "Mom, maybe you shouldn't come to the office party. It's more upscale." "Mom, don't say things like that around Savannah. She's sensitive." "Mom, you don't need to worry about these things. Just enjoy your retirement." Little cuts, little bruises, none deep enough on their own to make me protest, but deep enough, over years, to hollow something in me. Savannah didn't help matters. She was ambitious in a way that made the air around her feel tight, always dressed as though she were about to step onto a magazine cover, always seeing people as steps or obstacles, and always, always watching me with thin politeness, as though she were afraid I might stain her evening. I remember the first time she came to my house. She walked through the rooms slowly, her eyes drifting over the furniture George had built with his own hands, the faded rug I loved, the chipped teapot I refused to throw away because it still poured just fine. "It's quaint," she'd said, smiling the way one smiles at a stray dog they aren't sure they should pet. Oliver had laughed, too quickly, and kissed her temple as if rewarding her. I stood there feeling my cheeks warm, realizing something quietly humiliating. My home, my life, my history, none of it fit the version of success they wanted to display. After they married, the distance widened. Oliver's visits became rushed, distracted. Savannah never came unless she needed something. A short-term loan, a signature, a small favor. I gave, and I gave, and I gave. Because that's what mothers of only sons do when they fear losing the last thread that ties them to family. And then came the winter morning, the one I didn't understand fully until yesterday. He arrived early, smelling of expensive cologne, flipping through my mail as if it were his. "Mom, these bills need handling. Don't worry, I'll take care of it." He slid a few pages toward me with a pen. "Just routine stuff. Sign here." And I, half distracted, flattered by the attention, relieved that someone else was handling what felt overwhelming that month, signed where he pointed. I remember thinking how grown he looked, how capable, how foolish of me. Now, sitting in Harold's office, the memory burned my cheeks with a shame that didn't belong to me. It belonged to the woman who trusted too easily because she wanted to believe her son still saw her as more than an obligation. Harold paused in his explanation, giving me time to absorb the truth. Oliver shifted again, sighing loudly. "Mom, don't make this into something dramatic. You always overthink things." There it was. That small, dismissive tone he used when Savannah was around. Except she wasn't here today. This was entirely him. I looked at my hands. The same hands that had held him through fevers, braided his hair when he begged to look like the boy next door, signed permission slips, wiped tears, packed lunches. They didn't look like hands that deserved distrust. They looked like hands that had given too much. "Oliver," I said quietly, "why didn't you talk to me first?" He stared at the window. "Because you'd only worry, and this way is easier." For both of us. For both of us. As if I were a problem to be streamlined, an inconvenience to be managed. Harold cleared his throat again. "Mrs. Hale, if these documents proceed, the house would no longer legally belong to you." I nodded slowly. I felt the softness in my chest, the one I had carried for decades, begin to tighten into something firmer, sharper, a thread turning into a wire. "I see," I murmured. Oliver finally looked at me. "Mom, please don't be ridiculous. I'm trying to help you." Help. Such an interesting word from a man who had not asked how I was doing in months. Harold folded his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Hale, before we proceed, I need to ask a question for the official record. Do you confirm that you knowingly gave authorization for these actions?" Oliver leaned forward, confident. I kept my gaze steady. And for the first time in my life, I felt something powerful settle into my bones. "No," I said. "I did not." I didn't sleep that night. Not a single hour. My house was quiet in the way only old houses can be, breathing softly through wooden walls, settling now and then with a sigh. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once taught Oliver to read, and I stared at nothing. It's a strange thing, realizing you've been fooled not by a stranger, but by the one person you spent your whole life protecting. The betrayal doesn't strike like lightning. It creeps in slowly, settles in your bones, makes a home there. I kept seeing that morning in my mind. The stack of papers, Oliver's calm voice, the way he placed the pen into my hand like a son who cared. I remembered the steam from the kettle and the heavy winter coat he didn't bother taking off, as if he planned to leave quickly, as if he didn't want to sit with me longer than necessary. "Just some routine things, Mom. Sign here." Routine things. A house, a life, my safety. Routine. In Harold's office, when I said no, when I finally said it out loud, something inside me shifted. Not dramatically. Quietly, like a door closing in a long hallway. Harold had looked relieved. Oliver had looked annoyed. "Mom," he said, rubbing his forehead, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder, as if the difficulty was mine to cause and his to suffer." The part he didn't expect was that once the door inside me closed, it didn't open back up. I left Harold's office with a strange heaviness in my chest, but not the old softness that had lived there for years. This was different. Colder, firmer, like the beginning of a spine I had forgotten I possessed. At home, I boiled water for tea, poured it into my favorite cup, and never touched it. The tea sat there cooling, a thin layer of steam drifting away until the cup went still. I felt just like it, warm once, then cooling steadily. I walked through the house, touching the walls lightly, as though reassuring myself it was still mine. My fingers traced the doorframe where Oliver's height had been penciled in as he grew. The marks were still there, faint but legible. He had once been proud of each new line. Somewhere along the years, he stopped measuring himself against this home and began measuring me instead. My worth, my usefulness, my quietness. What a strange shift to go from being a mother to being a tool. I sat in the living room and tried to understand when exactly his tone had changed. When he stopped calling me Mom with affection and started saying it with impatience. When my opinions became inconvenient. When my presence became something to manage. Maybe it started when he married Savannah, a woman who never saw a thing she couldn't improve, correct, or polish. She was always politely distant with me, as though kindness toward an older woman would cost her something valuable. If she ever said Mrs. Hale, she said it like it tasted sour. I don't blame her for everything. It takes two people to build a wall, but only one to decorate it. Oliver decorated his well, with excuses, with dismissals, with convenience. It was that word that kept circling my mind. Convenience. The documents used it again and again, for my convenience, for easier management, for streamlined decisions. An old woman's life reduced to something that needed streamlining. At midnight, I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark. My reflection stared at me faintly from the window. Gray hair pulled back neatly, a face lined not by time, but by years of silence. A woman who had convinced herself patience was love and endurance was loyalty. I whispered into the quiet. I should have said something sooner. But the past does not rewind. It only watches. Around 3 a.m, I found myself standing in the small room where I kept boxes no one had opened in years. Old medical files, photographs, the faded sweater George used to wear in winter. I opened a drawer I barely touched anymore and took out the papers from the winter morning. Bills, envelopes, and the page with my signature. My own handwriting looked foreign to me. A shaky loop on the M, a hurried stroke on the Hale. He hadn't even let me read it. I sat on the floor and pressed my palms against the cold wood. My bones ached, but not from age, from remembering. Oliver had expected me to stay soft. He had expected Harold to process the papers quietly. He had expected the house to shift into his name without a whisper. But Harold didn't. He called me, and something inside me, something stronger than years of softness, woke up. When dawn finally crept in, I rose from the floor, stiff and exhausted. I looked around my little home, the chipped teapot, the worn armchair, the framed photographs, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. A sense of possession, a sense of dignity, a sense that I wasn't done yet. That morning, as the sun touched the curtains, I whispered a single sentence out loud, tasting it like a truth I'd been afraid to speak. He won't take my life from me. And for the first time in years, I believed myself. Harold waited until the door closed behind Oliver before he spoke. It was a quiet click, but it echoed through the room like a fall of stone. My son stood out in the hallway with his arms crossed, no doubt texting Savannah, no doubt preparing the story he'd tell her later. I imagined his message. Mom is confused. Harold is making this unnecessarily complicated. Men like my son always know how to phrase things to look blameless. Inside the office, Harold folded his hands and studied me with a gentleness I wasn't used to anymore. Not from anyone in my family, and certainly not from Oliver. "Mrs. Hale," he began, "I want to make sure you understand everything before we go further. These documents," he tapped the stack lightly, "were submitted as if you had signed them willingly." "I didn't," I said. He nodded. "I believe you, but the law needs more than belief." He turned the first page around so it faced me. "Let's look at this carefully." The papers were thick, the kind printed on crisp, expensive stock. My name appeared again and again. My signature, or something close enough, decorated the bottom of several pages. It was mine, yes. My hand had drawn those lines. But my mind had not agreed to what they validated. Harold read aloud, slowly, gently, but with a firmness underneath, a firmness meant to hold me steady. Clause 1, transfer of primary residence from Margaret Hale to Oliver Hale, to be executed upon approval of lender. My throat tightened. My house. The house George and I built a life in. The house I swept, repaired, warmed, and protected through winters and widowed years. "Continue," I whispered. Clause 2, authorization for the borrower, Oliver, to obtain a credit line secured by the property. A loan, against my home, taken by him. Harold glanced at me. This would put the deed in jeopardy if payments aren't made. "And who is responsible for those payments?" I asked. He sighed. "Technically, you." The room tilted slightly. I steadied myself against the edge of his desk. "Mrs. Hale," he said softly, "this would have left you with no legal claim to your own home and full liability for the debt." I closed my eyes. I didn't cry. Women like me learn early that tears don't fix what's broken. But I felt the sting behind my eyelids, the burn of seeing, finally, without excuses. Harold continued reading, page by page. I listened to each clause as though it were a confession, and in a way, it was. A confession of everything Oliver thought of me. Naive, forgetful, malleable, small. He expected me to sit through this quietly. He expected me to trust him blindly. He expected me to sign my life away because he handed me a pen. When Harold reached the last page, he placed it flat on the desk and folded his hands. "Mrs. Hale, do you recall signing anything that looked like this?" I rubbed my thumb over my palm. The memory was faint, but there. The winter light. The cluttered table. Oliver urging me to hurry because he had a meeting. The papers slid under my hand like a trick dealt by a practiced magician. "I signed," I said. "But I didn't know." Harold nodded as if he had expected exactly that. "Then this authorization is voidable," he said, "and I will begin reversing every action. But before I do, I think your son should hear your position directly." I took a breath. Deep. Steady. The kind a nurse takes before telling a family a truth they don't want to hear. "Bring him in," I said. Harold stood, opened the door, and gestured. Oliver walked back in, wearing that same expression: mild irritation, mild confidence, mild impatience, as if we were discussing repairs on a rental property, not the home that held my entire life. He sat down with a heavy sigh. "Mom," he said, "can we please stop dragging this out? You're making this—" I raised my hand, just a little, but enough. And for the first time in years, he went silent. "I did not understand what I signed," I said. My voice was calm, level. "And I did not authorize you to take my home or place debt in my name." Oliver blinked. "Mom, come on, it's just paperwork. Why are you making it sound like betrayal?" I asked. "What would you call it?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Harold instead, as if the older man were a referee who could be convinced. Harold's tone remained professional, but I noticed the faint steel beneath it. "Mr. Hale, your mother's statement invalidates the documents. They cannot proceed." Oliver stiffened. "This is ridiculous. She's confused. She doesn't remember." "I remember enough," I interrupted quietly. He exhaled sharply, leaning back. "You're overreacting. The house will still be yours, technically. I'd just manage—" "Manage?" I repeated. "You meant to own it." He winced just slightly. There it was, the truth, flickering through. For a long moment, the three of us sat in silence. The kind of silence that separates what was from what will be. Finally, I folded my hands in my lap, "Oliver," I said, "sit down properly. We're not finished." He sat up, startled by the tone he didn't recognize, the one that didn't bend anymore. Harold looked at me with quiet respect. And inside me, inside the place where softness used to live, something new began to grow. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. He sat there, shoulders tightening the way they used to when he was a boy, caught doing something he knew he shouldn't. But he wasn't a boy anymore. And this wasn't a broken window or a lie about homework. This was my life he had tampered with. My home, my safety, my trust. I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap. They weren't shaking. I noticed that, with a strange calm. For years, whenever Oliver raised his voice or dismissed me, some part of me trembled. Not today. "Oliver," I said quietly, "I need you to listen. Truly, listen. Not the way you do when you're already planning your reply." His jaw tensed. "Mom, I didn't do anything wrong. I was trying to organize things." "You were trying to take control of my house," I interrupted, my voice even. "And you assumed I would never question you." Harold stayed silent at his desk, but I felt his presence like a shield at my back. Steady, watchful. Oliver leaned forward, lowering his voice to something he must have thought convincing. "Mom, you need help. You think you're keeping everything straight, but you're 72. You forget things." There it was. The excuse. The easy label. Old. Forgetful. A woman whose signature he could pocket whenever needed. "I forget less than you think," I replied. "I remember every bill I've paid for you. Every time I watched your children because you and Savannah had dinner plans. Every ride, every loan, every time you said you'd pay it back and never did." He frowned, as though I'd dredged up something unnecessary. "That's different." "No," I said. "It's exactly the same." He looked at Harold again, expecting the lawyer to intervene, but Harold kept his hands folded, waiting for my lead. The quiet in the room thickened, stretched, settled. I let it. Then I said the words I had swallowed for years. "You treat me like an inconvenience." Oliver blinked. "Mom, that's not fair." "Fair?" I leaned forward slightly. Fair would have been asking me. Fair would have been explaining. Fair would have been respecting that I am still capable of deciding what happens to the house I worked my life for. His face reddened. I didn't want to burden you. You didn't want to deal with me. He exhaled sharply, frustrated. Mom, why are you making this so dramatic? It's just property. My heart pulled tight, but my voice stayed steady. It's my home, Oliver. My memories. My last place that's truly mine. Your father carried me through that doorway after our wedding. I held you in that living room the night you had your first fever. I buried your father, and that house kept me upright through the worst of it. Don't you dare call it just property. Harold shifted slightly, but he still didn't speak. He didn't need to. Oliver finally leaned back, folding his arms, defeated in the way stubborn men become when they realize brute confidence isn't working. So what now? He muttered. Now. Such a small word for such a turning point. Now, I said, Harold will begin the legal steps to invalidate everything, the transfer, the credit line, all of it. Oliver's eyes widened. You're overreacting. And you underestimated me. For the first time all morning, his confidence cracked. I saw something flicker behind his expression. Not guilt. No, he wasn't ready for that. But recognition. Recognition that the woman sitting across from him wasn't the soft, pliable mother he'd counted on. She was someone else now. Someone awake. I'm not angry, I said, surprising even myself with the truth of it. I'm disappointed. You wanted control, Oliver, not responsibility, and certainly not my permission. He swallowed hard, his mouth tightening. Mom, he tried again. This doesn't have to become a whole situation. Let's talk privately. Just you and me. No, I said. No more private conversations where I sign what I don't understand. Everything from now on will be in writing, with Harold present. That stunned him more than anything else I'd said. He opened his mouth, closed it, then pushed back from the chair with a scraped sigh. Fine. Do whatever you want. He stood, but I didn't. I simply watched him walk out, his pride hitting every wall on the way. When the door closed, Harold let out a breath. Mrs. Hale, he said softly, that was impressive. No, I said quietly, that was overdue. And for the first time in many years, I felt my spine straighten all on its own. The house felt different when I walked back into it that afternoon. As if the walls themselves had overheard everything in Harold's office and were now holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, my coat still on, my purse heavy on my arm. The quiet wasn't comforting the way it used to be. It was expectant. I hung up my coat slowly, my fingers stiff from the cold and from the truth I had finally spoken aloud. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's untouched tea. The cup still sat on the counter, a thin ring dried at the bottom. I washed it, even though there was no need. Some gestures are just ways of steadying your heartbeat. It wasn't anger that followed me through the rooms, not even sadness. What settled in me was something colder, clearer, a kind of winter in the soul, sharp, honest, impossible to ignore. I walked to the living room and sat in my chair, the one with the worn arms where George used to rest his hands while he read the paper. I could almost hear the crinkle of the pages, the soft way he'd hum when he concentrated. He'd never raised his voice at me in 34 years of marriage. Not once. If he disagreed, he did it gently. If he corrected, he did it kindly. And if he wanted something changed, he asked, He never assumed. Oliver had grown up with that example. Yet somewhere along the path of becoming successful, he forgot gentleness was also a form of strength. My hands rested in my lap, and I studied them. These hands had tended wounds, changed dressings, fed patients who couldn't lift a spoon. They had raised a child, buried a husband, held their own through grief. Why on earth had I begun to believe those same hands were no longer capable of signing their own future? A wave of exhaustion passed through me. It wasn't physical, not the usual ache in my knees or the heaviness in my back. It was the kind of tiredness that settles deep, where disappointment sits like a stone. I leaned my head back and stared at the ceiling. I should have drawn the line sooner, I whispered into the empty room. But the past didn't answer. It never does. As evening approached, shadows stretched long across the floor. I made myself a simple dinner out of habit, though I barely touched it. My appetite had left me hours ago, somewhere between Harold's steady voice and Oliver's excuses. When I finally sat down at the kitchen table, my phone began to vibrate. First once, then again, then several times in a row. His name flashed on the screen each time. Oliver. Part of me wanted to answer just to see what tone he would use now. Apology? Frustration? Manipulation? I knew them all well enough to imagine each version. But I also knew that any conversation today, in this raw moment, would give him room to twist my resolve. So I silenced the phone and let it ring until it grew tired. Outside, a wind picked up, brushing against the windows like a restless thought. I stood and went to the hallway closet, taking out the small metal box where I kept important things. Birth certificates, George's watch, the deed to the house. I set them neatly on the table. I needed to see my life laid out plainly, without anyone else's handwriting on it. One by one, I opened the envelopes. I read every line, and with each page, something inside me settled into place. This was my life. This was my home. And no one, not even the boy I had carried into this world, had the right to take it out from under me. When the phone rang again, a longer, more insistent vibration, I turned it face down. I went to the window instead, watching the sky darken into deep blue. I felt strangely steady, not happy, not relieved, but firm, a firmness I had forgotten I possessed. The night grew colder, but I didn't. I wrapped a shawl over my shoulders and sat back down at the table, stacking the documents into a clean, purposeful pile. Tomorrow, I told myself, would not be a day of confusion or fear. Tomorrow would be the day I began putting my life back into my own hands. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't doubt myself. Morning always feels colder after a night like that. Not because of the temperature, but because the world looks different once you've finally opened your eyes. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing my teacup, and felt an unfamiliar steadiness spreading through me, something like resolve, though quieter. I wasn't trembling anymore. At 9 sharp, I took my coat, my purse, and the folder I'd prepared during the night, the one with every important paper I owned. I locked the door behind me and tested the handle twice, the way I always do. A habit of a woman who has lived alone long enough to know no one is coming to double-check behind her. The street was empty as I walked to the car. A few leaves scattered along the pavement, scraped by the wind. My breath came out in small clouds. My steps felt heavier than usual, but my spine felt straighter. The bank stood 3 blocks away, a modest brick building I'd visited for decades. They knew me there by name. Or they used to, before Oliver began helping me with finances and doing most things online. Today, I wanted people to look me in the eye again. To remember, I was not a signature on a screen, but a woman capable of walking through a door on her own 2 feet. Inside, the warmth hit my face. A young teller, bright smile, polished nails, greeted me. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale. How can we help you today?" Funny how a real greeting can feel like a kindness when your family forgets to offer one. "I need to speak with someone about my accounts," I said. "All of them." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. One moment." While I waited, I glanced around the lobby. I remembered standing here with George the day we opened our first joint account. He held my hand the whole time, joking about how we were officially, financially married now. He used to make everything feel lighter. But today, I wasn't thinking about lightness. Today was about taking back what had slipped out of my hands too quietly. A door opened, and the branch manager, a kind, middle-aged man named Vernon, approached me. "Mrs. Hale," he said warmly, "come on back." He led me into his office, and I sat down, placing my folder on the desk. He adjusted his glasses, noticing the thickness of it. "What can I do for you?" I took a slow breath. "I want every authorization that isn't mine removed, every outside access revoked, and I want to review all activity on every account." He nodded, but I saw the flicker of concern. "Of course. Is there a particular reason?" "Yes," I said. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have." He didn't ask who. A kindness I appreciated. He began pulling up my records, and with each page he turned, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief, not yet, but the easing of a knot that had been tightening for years. It shocked me how many automatic payments were tied to Oliver. Insurance premiums, subscriptions, fees I never agreed to, transfers marked as household support. I scanned each one, my pulse steady. "These need to stop," I said. "All of them?" he asked gently. "All," I confirmed. "Every single one." He clicked through the screens, pausing now and then to confirm details. I answered each question clearly. I didn't stumble once. It felt good to speak without being interrupted, talked over, or dismissed. When he finally turned the monitor toward me, the pages were clean. Access blocked. Authorizations canceled. Controls returned to my own name. "Is there anything else you'd like, Mrs. Hale?" I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it. "Yes," I said. "I want protection. Whatever measures you have to make sure no one can move a cent without my permission." He nodded. "We can put in a layered verification system." He paused. "Only you. No exceptions." The words settled over me like a blanket. Only you. That had a different meaning now. As he finished the paperwork, I felt my phone vibrate in my purse again. I didn't need to look. It was Oliver. Persistence born of panic. Vernon noticed the movement but said nothing. When everything was printed and signed, he walked me to the door. "If you need anything," he said softly, "you come to us. Directly." I thanked him and stepped outside. The air was colder than before, but I barely felt it. I sat in my car for a moment, letting the silence surround me. Not the silence of fear or uncertainty. That was last night's silence. This one was different. This was the quiet after a battle you didn't expect to fight. And won anyway. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands steady on the wheel. Tomorrow, I knew, the real confrontation would come. But today I had taken back what was mine. When I returned home, The house greeted me with its usual stillness, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt observant, as if it knew something inside me had shifted. I set my purse on the hall table and slipped off my shoes. The phone vibrated again in my pocket, its insistence almost comical now. I didn't check it. Some things can wait. I made myself tea, not because I needed it, but because the small ritual steadied my thoughts. Steam curled up from the cup as I carried it to the living room. I hadn't taken 2 sips when the phone buzzed once more. Oliver's name flashed across the screen, bold and impatient. I let it ring out. He called again, then again. Finally, a message arrived. "Mom, something's wrong with the bank. Call me now." I smiled into my tea. Not a triumphant smile, just a tired, knowing one. The kind a woman gives when the inevitable finally arrives. He had discovered the first consequences. A few minutes later came another message. "Why are payments bouncing? Did you change something? This isn't funny." Funny? Yes, that was exactly the word for it. I set the phone aside on the table and watched the late afternoon light stretch across the carpet. It had been years since I let a message from my son sit unanswered. Years since I'd allowed silence to be my answer. It felt strangely peaceful. But peace didn't last. Not today. At 5:14 p.m., the knocking started. Hard, fast, impatient. I closed my eyes briefly. I had known this moment would come. "Mom, open the door. We need to talk. Right now." I rose slowly, not rushing. My knees ached, but my resolve didn't. I walked to the door and paused, with my hand on the knob. His voice carried through the wood, frantic in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child who'd lost something precious. Only this time, what he'd lost wasn't a toy. It was control. When I opened the door, Oliver stood there, breath visible in the cold evening air, coat half zipped, frustration tightening every line of his face. "Why didn't you answer? What did you do at the bank?" he demanded. Not hello, not are you all right, just accusation. I stepped aside without inviting him in. Still, he walked past me quickly, as though the house still belonged to him. In the living room, he turned on me. "Everything's frozen. Payments are blocked. Authorizations removed. Mom, what were you thinking?" I took a slow breath. "I was thinking," I said calmly, "about my future." He blinked hard, as though the words didn't fit into his idea of who I was. "Your future? Mom, you're being ridiculous. This affects me. Savannah. The kids, no," I said. "It affects only me, because it's my money, my house, my name on every account." He raked a hand through his hair. "Mom, you're creating chaos. Why would you do this without talking to me? You always talk to me about things like this." I met his eyes. "No, Oliver. I listened. You talked." For a heartbeat, he froze. The truth has a way of doing that. Then he tried a softer tone, one he used to use when he wanted something expensive as a teenager. "Mom, come on. We can fix this. Just reverse whatever you did at the bank. It's just a misunderstanding." I almost felt sorry for him. Not because he was struggling, but because he still thought the old rules applied. "Oliver," I said quietly, "there is no misunderstanding." I protected myself. His mouth dropped open slightly, as if he hadn't expected the simplicity of it. "You don't need protection from me," he argued. "Everyone needs protection," I replied, "especially from those who think they're entitled." The room went still. He stared at me, shocked, not by my words, but by the fact that I had said them. That the woman who once went along with everything had finally stepped out of the shadow he'd built around her. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost wary. "What are you trying to do, Mom?" I held his gaze, unblinking. "Take my life back." He stared at me as if I'd spoken a language he no longer understood. Maybe I had. The language of a woman who finally stopped bending. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, like he was flipping through familiar scripts but couldn't find the right one. "Take your life back?" he repeated. "From me?" "From anyone who thinks it's theirs to manage," I said. For a moment, he looked almost offended, as if I'd accused him falsely, as if the papers he'd pushed in front of me were nothing more than a paperwork hiccup instead of a knife carefully inserted where he thought I was softest. He took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "Mom, listen. You're blowing this out of proportion. I was trying to make things easier for you." I sat down in my chair, the one that had molded itself to my back over years of quiet evenings. I folded my hands. "Ease isn't taken, Oliver. It's offered." He hesitated. My tone threw him off. Not angry, not pleading, simply factual. He didn't know how to fight someone who wasn't playing defense. "You should have talked to me," he insisted, pacing now. "You can't just change everything without warning. It affects my entire family." I lifted my gaze. "Your decisions affected mine." He froze mid-step. "You used my signature without explanation. You redirected my finances. You planned to move my home into your name without asking." I paused. "Don't talk to me about consequences." His face tightened, the way it always did when he was losing ground. "I thought we were a family. Families help each other." "Help," I said softly, "is not the same thing as control." He swallowed hard. For a moment, he looked younger. Not in a sentimental way, but in the way of someone whose foundations had been quietly removed while he was still standing on them. "You're making me out to be some kind of villain," he muttered. "No," I answered. "I'm making you face what you did." That landed. He looked away. The silence between us thickened. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, as though it, too, was waiting for him to grow up. Not younger, older, more honest. He sat down across from me, elbows on his knees, head lowered for a moment. When he finally lifted it, his voice was quieter. "Mom, I didn't think you'd care. About the paperwork. About any of it. You never said no before." Ah. There it was. Not cruelty, not malice. Assumption. He assumed I'd stay silent forever. He assumed my trust was permanent. He assumed a mother's love was the same as a surrender. "I didn't say no," I replied, "because I still believed you saw me as your mother, not an obstacle." He opened his mouth, but no excuse came out. I continued, my voice steady. "Oliver, I have lived 72 years. I have worked, saved, built, and survived. I have earned the right to be the keeper of my own life." His face pinched, uncertainty creeping into the spaces arrogance used to fill. "So what now?" he asked quietly. "Now." The word again, small and heavy. "Now," I said, "everything changes. I will handle my own accounts, my own home, my own decisions." "And me?" he asked. It wasn't a question I expected. It caught something tender inside me. Not softness, no, but history. "You," I said gently, "will have to learn how to know me without using me." For the first time that day, he had no answer. He leaned back slowly, breath shaky in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child, afraid of disappointing someone. But he wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing the version of me that existed for his benefit. He stood after a moment, avoiding my eyes. I need time to think. So do I said. He walked to the door, hand hovering for a moment before he opened it. Mom, he said without turning. Yes? I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't reply. Some words aren't meant to be met. Some words are nothing more than an echo of guilt. When the door closed behind him, the house exhaled. Or maybe it was me. Either way, the quiet felt different now, not hollow, clear. I didn't expect her to come that evening. Not after the day I'd had, not after the years of strained politeness between us, but just past 6, as the sun lowered itself behind the rooftops, the doorbell rang. A soft, almost apologetic chime. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door. It was Lily, my granddaughter, 19 years old, shoulders hunched against the cold, her backpack slung over one arm. She looked at me the way only young people can look at the elderly, as though we might break if spoken to too loudly. Grandma, can I come in? I stepped aside immediately. Of course, dear. She walked in quietly, her eyes scanning my face as if searching for signs of damage. I wasn't sure what Oliver had told her, but her expression held worry, not judgment. She set her backpack down near the sofa and sat carefully, as though afraid to disturb something fragile in the room. Dad's upset, she said finally. I'm aware. She bit her lip. He wouldn't tell me everything, just that something blew up with the house and you. She frowned. He looked scared, Grandma. Not angry. Scared. I believed that. People often confuse losing control with fear. I sat across from her, folding my hands. Your father made decisions that weren't his to make, and I stopped him. She absorbed that slowly. Her eyes, warm, sincere, so much gentler than her parents', didn't widen or harden. They softened. Good, she said simply. That single word surprised me more than anything Oliver had said all week. Good, I repeated. She nodded, leaning forward. Grandma, Dad doesn't listen to anyone, not really. He gets these ideas and runs with them. Mom encourages him, or pushes him, or I don't know. She shook her head. He thinks he's helping, but he doesn't ask what people need. I let the words settle. Hearing her say it, calmly, without bitterness, felt like having a window opened in a stuffy room. Did he tell you what he wanted to do with the house? I asked softly. She hesitated. Not exactly, but I overheard my parents arguing a few days ago. Mom said the house would finally be useful, and Dad told her to be patient. Ah, useful. That word again, the one people use when they no longer see you as a person. Lily looked at me with a seriousness far beyond her age. Grandma, you know they were planning something, right? Something involving the house? I nodded. I know now. She took a deep breath, her eyes dropping to her hands. I could see the guilt creeping in. Not hers, but the inherited kind. The kind children feel when they see the cracks in their parents' character. I'm sorry, she whispered. I moved to sit beside her, placing a hand over hers. You have nothing to apologize for. But you're alone, she said, voice trembling. You shouldn't have to deal with this by yourself. I felt something warm bloom in my chest. Not softness, no, but recognition. She was the only one in the family who had ever visited without an agenda. The only one who came because she wanted to, not because she wanted something. I'm not as alone as you think, I said, and I am stronger than your father realizes. She looked up at me, eyes glassy. I've always known that. That made me smile. A small, honest smile I hadn't felt rise in days. Lily took a deep breath and spoke carefully. Grandma, whatever you decide to do next, I want you to know I'm here. For you. Not because I have to be. Because I want to be. There it was. The thing I hadn't known I needed. Not a promise. Not a defense. Just presence. I squeezed her hand gently. Thank you, sweetheart. We sat together in quiet for a long moment. Two women from different ends of life, both understanding far more than Oliver ever bothered to imagine. After a while, she opened her backpack and pulled out a small paper bag. I brought you something. I stopped by that bakery you like. Inside was a warm roll coated in sugar. Not much, but enough. I thought you might want something sweet, she said. I do, I replied. And for the first time since everything began, something in me softened. Not into weakness, but into a quiet, steady kind of hope. The next morning was bright but cold. The kind of cold that makes every breath feel sharper. I woke earlier than usual, not because of worry, but because I finally knew what needed to be done. There's a clarity that comes after a long stretch of silence, the kind that settles in your bones and refuses to leave. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple gray coat and the scarf George bought me one Christmas long ago. It felt right to wear something steady, something that reminded me of who I had been before all this fear and doubt crept in. Harold's office was quiet when I arrived. His assistant greeted me warmly and led me to his door. He stood when I entered, as though acknowledging a shift in the balance between us, not of power, but of certainty. Mrs. Hale, he said with a small smile, I was expecting you. I imagine so, I replied, taking my seat. I'm ready to make changes. He nodded, sliding a folder toward me. I prepared several documents after our meeting, but I want to go through each one with you slowly. Good, I said. Slow is exactly what I want. He opened the first document, the revocation of the power of attorney I never meant to give. This will permanently remove your son's ability to act on your behalf in any financial or legal matter. Once signed and filed, all prior permissions become invalid. My eyes skimmed the page. This is the beginning, I murmured. Harold nodded. It is. I signed. My hand didn't shake. Next came the will, not rewritten quickly, not adjusted with vague implications, but rebuilt from the ground as something that reflected my choices, not the ones others wanted from me. We discussed your wishes last time, he said gently, but I want to confirm them. Your estate will go primarily to your granddaughter Lily, through a protected trust. Yes, I said. She is the only one who sees me, not what I own. He made a note. The trust ensures your son cannot access or redirect the funds. It becomes available to her only for education, housing, or essential expenses until she reaches a set age. Good, I replied. Make it strong. Make it clear. Harold looked at me with quiet respect. It already is. We reviewed property protections, financial safeguards, and healthcare directives. Every line took a weight off my chest. Not because I was planning for the end, but because I was finally planning for myself. When we reached the last page, he tapped it lightly. And this, he said, is a declaration that all future decisions must be verified by you in writing. No exceptions. No digital signatures unless confirmed verbally with the office. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I didn't know I was allowed to have this much control. He smiled gently. Mrs. Hale, you always were. You just needed someone to remind you. Outside the window, a branch moved in the wind, its shadow gliding across the desk. For a moment I saw myself in that movement, bent from years of storms, but not broken, never broken. Harold, I said softly, thank you for not assuming I was confused. You're not confused, he replied. You're reclaiming your ground. I signed the final document. The sound of the pen on paper felt like a door closing behind me, not shutting me in, but keeping something harmful out. When it was done, Harold gathered the papers carefully, almost ceremonially. Everything here will be filed today, he said. Your son will be notified in due time. You owe him no explanation. I stood slowly, my knees protesting, but the rest of me stronger than it had been in years. Maybe I don't owe him one, I said, but I think he'll demand one. Harold's expression softened. Demands only work on those willing to obey. I smiled, a quiet, tired, victorious smile. I'm done obeying, I said, and I walked out of that office feeling a little taller, a little steadier, and unmistakably free. I had barely set my purse down when the storm began. First came the messages, short, sharp, increasingly frantic. Oliver, we need to talk. Oliver, why did Harold contact me? Oliver, what did you sign? Oliver, Mom, answer me. I didn't. Silence is a language, too. One I had learned far too late but was finally learning to use. Around early afternoon, I heard the car doors slam, not one, two. Heavy, quick footsteps on the porch, followed by a loud, impatient knock. Savannah. Her knock always sounded like ownership, as though she believed doors existed to obey her, not to separate her from places she hadn't earned the right to enter. I opened the door just enough to see her expression. Polished anger, bright as her cold red lipstick. Oliver stood slightly behind her, hands stuffed into his coat pockets, caught between frustration and dread. Margaret, she said, not Mrs. Hale, and certainly not Mom. Just my name, clipped. We need to discuss the chaos you've caused. I stepped aside, though I didn't invite them deeper than the living room. People who come with intentions like theirs don't deserve the warmth of a kitchen. Savannah walked in first, her heels clicking across the hardwood. Oliver followed, quieter than usual. She crossed her arms. Harold contacted Oliver. He said you revoked the power of attorney. Her voice sharpened. Why would you do something like that without consulting us? I almost laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. Consulting us, as though my life had become a committee project. I revoked it, I said calmly, because I never intended to give it. Savannah's perfect eyebrows lifted. Then you misunderstood. No, I replied. I was misled. Her lips tightened. She had come ready to instruct, not to listen. Margaret, she continued, you don't realize how complicated finances are at your age. Oliver was simply trying to help. You've put everything at risk by acting impulsively. I sat in my chair, the one that knew my shape. Calmness settled over me like a quilt. Savannah, I said quietly, the only risk to my life was letting someone else run it. She opened her mouth, offended. Oliver finally stepped forward. Mom, please. You're making this harder on everyone. If you'd talked to us, we could have explained. You explained enough in Harold's office, I said. Every word after that was noise. Savannah straightened sharply, a woman used to controlling the temperature of a room. Do you have any idea how this affects us financially? There it is, I murmured. The truth. She bristled. Don't twist my words. We planned around certain expectations. I met her eyes. Expectations built on my home, my credit, my property. She looked away first. Oliver sighed heavily. Mom, you have to undo this. People our age, you're 45, I cut in. You're not elderly, and neither am I incapable. He inhaled, frustrated. Okay, fine. But what about the trust Harold mentioned? Why would you exclude us like that? Because love should feel like safety, not strategy. Because the only person in this family who visits me without calculation is Lily. Because motherhood is not a debt a son can collect interest on. But I didn't say those things aloud. Some truths belong to the heart, not to arguing mouths. I made decisions, I said steadily, based on who has shown me care, not convenience. Savannah's eyes flashed. So, you're punishing us? No, I answered. I'm protecting myself. Oliver threw his hands up. Mom, this is insane. You're choosing Lily over your own son. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see my little boy anywhere in his face. Just a man who had grown too comfortable with my silence. I'm choosing what's right, I said. Savannah scoffed. This isn't over. No, I replied softly. It's simply no longer yours to decide. The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it was final. Savannah grabbed her purse and walked out. Oliver lingered for a moment, his eyes searching mine for the softness he used to rely on. But I wasn't that woman anymore. He left without another word. When the door closed, the house was quiet again. A different quiet. Not lonely, not fearful, just mine. The house stayed quiet long after their footsteps faded down the walkway. Not the fragile kind of quiet that comes before tears, but the steady, decisive kind that settles after a choice has been made. I stood for a moment in the center of the living room, feeling the air slowly return to normal, as though the walls themselves were letting go of tension they had absorbed. I didn't rush to sit down. Instead, I moved through the rooms with slow, deliberate steps, turning off lights, straightening a picture frame, picking up a blanket that had slipped from the sofa. All small gestures, but they grounded me. They reminded me that this home was still under my hands, not under someone else's plans. The doorbell didn't ring again. No new messages came. Even the phone seemed to understand the need for distance. It was nearly an hour later when I finally heard a car pull up again. Just one door this time, closed gently. Not Savannah, not her style. A hesitant knock followed, softer, uncertain. I opened the door. Oliver stood there alone, hands deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. The anger had drained out of him, leaving something tired behind. He looked like a man who had run out of easy answers. Mom, he said quietly, can we talk? Just us? I stepped aside, not inviting, not refusing. He walked in slowly, as though the house itself might reject him. He didn't sit right away. He stood near the doorway, staring at the floor. I shouldn't have let her speak to you like that, he murmured. A small acknowledgement, but still far from understanding. She spoke the way she always speaks, I replied. I just finally chose to hear it clearly. He winced, and I saw him struggle with words he hadn't prepared. He wasn't here to argue. He didn't have the energy left for that. But he wasn't here to apologize either. Not fully. Not yet. I know you think I tried to take advantage of you, he said, but I didn't mean it that way. Meaning, intention, the shields of people who don't want to face impact. I folded my hands in my lap. You meant to take control. You didn't see it as harm because you never imagined I would mind." He closed his eyes briefly. "Mom, I just wanted to make things secure." "For whom?" I asked. That question made him lift his head, slowly, reluctantly. The truth sat there in the space between us. He didn't answer, because he couldn't answer honestly without hearing himself say something ugly. After a long pause, he walked to the window and stood with his back to me. "You've always been strong," he said. "Stronger than anyone. I thought you were tired of dealing with everything alone." "Tired?" I repeated softly. "Yes, but not helpless." He pressed a hand to the window frame. "I didn't know you felt pushed aside." "You didn't want to know," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because it's easier to manage someone who stays quiet. He turned. The expression on his face wasn't anger now. It was confusion, mixed with grief. But grief for what? Losing control? Losing the version of me that asked nothing? "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. "I'm not asking you to fix it," I replied. "I'm asking you to understand it." He sat down, finally, elbows on his knees, a familiar pose from his childhood, the shape he took when he knew he'd crossed a line but didn't know how to step back from it. But I wasn't going to guide him this time. I wasn't going to offer him an easier version of the truth. "I love you," I said quietly. "That hasn't changed, but I cannot let you handle my life as if I'm already gone." He swallowed hard, eyes lowering. "I never meant—" "I know," I said, "but intention doesn't erase consequence." Silence stretched between us, long, deep, honest. After a while he rose. His voice was low when he spoke. "I need time." "So do I." He walked to the door, hesitated, then looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Uncertain, vulnerable, unsure of where to place his feet next. "Good night, Mom," he said. "Good night, Oliver." He left quietly this time. When the door clicked shut, I exhaled, slow and steady. The house felt lighter. Not because the conflict was over, but because something inside me had finally settled into its rightful place. Not a goodbye, just a boundary, a long overdue one. The days that followed felt strangely calm, not peaceful, not yet, but balanced, like a room that had finally been aired out after years of stale breath. I moved through my routines slowly, deliberately, rediscovering the parts of my life that had grown dim under the weight of obligations I never realized I was carrying. I brewed tea in the mornings and actually drank it while it was hot. I opened curtains earlier, letting sunlight touch the corners that had lived too long in shadow. I walked to the mailbox without bracing myself for bills Oliver insisted on handling. And every evening, I sat in my chair and let the house settle around me the way it used to, as a companion, not a burden. It's remarkable how different a home feels when you stop being afraid of losing it. My phone stayed quiet for a day, then another. Oliver didn't come by, and Savannah didn't send a single message. I didn't know if that was silence born of anger or reflection, but either way, it gave me room to breathe. Room I hadn't had in years. On the third day, Lily visited again. She came without knocking this time, which made me smile. "Grandma, I brought soup," she announced, holding a container as if it were a treasure. "I tried that recipe you always make." We ate together at the kitchen table. She chatted about school, her roommate, a professor who reminded her of her grandfather. I listened, letting her voice braid gently with the hum of the house. When someone loves you without agenda, You feel it in the air. At one point she paused, studying me with thoughtful eyes. You look different, she said. How so? I don't know. Lighter, like you're finally standing on your own feet. I let out a small laugh. I've been standing all my life. I just forgot to notice. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and for the first time since all this began, I felt something warm inside me. Not relief, not pride, but a quiet kind of dignity returning to its rightful place. Later that afternoon, after Lily left, I stepped into the backyard. The air was crisp, the sky a pale winter blue. I hadn't been out here in months, but the garden still remembered me. The rosemary bush had survived the cold, stubborn and fragrant, as it always was. I touched its leaves and felt a small joy bloom unexpectedly. This was my land, my life, still here, still mine. As I walked back inside, I noticed something I hadn't before: the absence of fear. For so many years I had lived in a quiet dread that the house would fall into disrepair, that my health would falter, that my family would decide for me instead of with me, that I would become invisible in my own home. But now the air felt open. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into my chair, watching the light dim toward evening. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was a companion, a witness to how far I'd come in just a few days. My life wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was mine again, in every sense of the word. And standing there in the doorway of my living room, watching dusk gather like a soft shawl over the neighborhood, I knew one thing with certainty. I hadn't taken revenge. I hadn't won a fight. I had simply returned to myself, and that, at 72, felt like a beginning. The morning I returned to Harold's office felt different from the others. Not colder, not warmer, just clearer, as though the world had finally settled into its proper shape, and all I had to do was walk through it without lowering my gaze. I dressed simply, pulling my hair back the way I used to when George and I volunteered at the community center. Practical, neat, a woman with purpose. When I stepped outside, the air held a faint sweetness, the kind that only appears when winter begins to step aside, not fully gone, but willing to loosen its hold. Harold greeted me with a quiet nod as I entered. "Everything is ready, Mrs. Hale." I sat across from him. The papers were arranged in a clean stack, each page waiting for the final signature that would put an end to the questions, the doubts, the manipulations that had crept into my life without my noticing. He walked me through each document a last time. Nothing rushed. Nothing assumed. Every line spoken aloud, every detail placed gently in my hands. I listened, steady and sure. When he finished, he slid the final sheet toward me. "This last signature," he said, "formalizes the changes. After today, nothing can be altered without your explicit instruction." I picked up the pen. My fingers didn't tremble. The black ink flowed smoothly across the paper, bending into the shape of my name. A name I had nearly allowed to become secondary in my own life. I set the pen down and exhaled slowly. It was done. Harold gathered the papers, handling them with a kind of reverence. "You should be proud," he said softly. "Not everyone finds their voice again at this stage in life." I gave a small smile. It was never gone. I simply stopped using it. He walked me to the door, his expression warm. "If anything else arises, you know where to find me." "I do," I said. Outside, the sunlight felt different. Not brighter, but honest. I walked slowly toward home, savoring the familiar cracks in the sidewalk, the branches bending gently in the breeze, the sound of a dog barking 2 houses down. Ordinary things. Steady things. My house looked the same from the outside, the faded shutters, the porch railing. George swore he'd fix and never did. But as I opened the door, I felt something shift inside me again. The subtle click of a place recognizing its owner. I stepped into the living room, into the quiet that no longer frightened me. I touched the back of my chair, the one that held me through long nights and longer years. I let my hand rest there, just briefly. This home was still mine. This life was still mine. And I had taken it back without shouting, without breaking, without surrendering a single piece of myself. In the end, the victory wasn't loud. It was a woman standing exactly where she belonged, breathing freely for the first time in a long while. I sat down, letting the quiet settle around me like a soft blanket. Not the quiet of loneliness, the quiet of ownership, of clarity, of dignity restored. And for a moment, I closed my eyes and whispered into the space that had once felt empty. I'm still here. The house seemed to breathe with me. If you want more stories in this voice, with truth, strength, and quiet fire, follow, save, comment, or simply tell me to begin the next one.